Hello to everybody and welcome to our VC House meeting today. And today we are talking to a really interesting personality, Chris Ye. He is a founding partner of Blitzscaling Ventures and also an author of Blitzscaling book, which he wrote together with Reid Hoffman, the founder of LinkedIn. And I believe today we'll have a really interesting interview. And so, Chris, probably let's start. Can you tell us about yourself, about your background, and how it happened that you are in venture capital industry today?
Sure thing. Thank you so much for having me, Alexander and Sasha. It's a pleasure to be here. So I got started in venture capital because I was interested in the startup world. I didn't grow up wanting to be in the startup world. I had no idea about any of this stuff. This was all from an earlier era when most of the time people didn't grow up being aware of these things. But when I was at Stanford, that was for my undergraduate work, that was when the internet first started becoming big. I was part of the first class at Stanford to receive email when I was a freshman. And so I was convinced the internet was going to be revolutionary. And I had the opportunity to go into the startup world instead of a conventional career path. And I worked for D.E. Shaw on startup programs. And D.E. Shaw, of course, is the company where Jeff Bezos worked before he founded Amazon. And then went to Harvard Business School and came back out to Silicon Valley in the year 2000 and have been involved in the startup field here ever since. Now, the reason I became involved in the venture capital field instead of just being an entrepreneur is eventually I got older and, I was jokingly say that entrepreneurship is often a young person's game. You are just working so hard around the clock. And eventually I had kids. And it was around that time that I decided it was just too much work to be a CEO. And so I gave up being a CEO and eventually migrated over into being an investor. And again, people people say that venture capitalists work hard. They absolutely do, but it's nothing like being a CEO. And so it's much more to my taste.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's talk a bit about your fund. So, can we start probably from your investment strategy? So, in which kind of startups do you invest, industries, check size, and stages?
Certainly. So Blitzscaling Ventures has a very simple investment philosophy. We invest in the best companies of the best VCs. So we look at the top 35 VCs, all the big names, and we review all the deals that they do. And we look at those deals and we pick out the ones we like the best. We want deals where they are attacking a valuable winner take most market and where they have a clear sense of market leadership already. And so typically we're investing in companies at the Series B stage. It could also be Series A or Series C. And the idea is we're investing in companies that are growing rapidly, who are dealing with the stresses of growth and want advice from the person who helped write the book on hypergrowth to navigate the kinds of issues that they run into. And we get in touch with the CEOs and they bring us into the subsequent round of funding. So we'll get in touch with people after their seed or Series A round and then invest in their A or B round. And we typically invest a $1 million check. So we're not leading the rounds, we're just a part of the syndicate. But we're trying to make sure that the CEO bakes us into the round before they start fundraising. So we don't have to worry about the difficulties of getting allocation into a hot round. We're getting allocation because we've already been demonstrating value add to the CEO.
So just to clarify that, now you started working with the company before they
That's
started
right.
right? The round. And when you go and I call it sequoias of the world, you already in.
That's
It's not
correct.
that the big fund invited you in a hot deal because we know how like that club works, right? They don't exactly invite people in a hot deal.
Correct. And there are some funds where we have good relationships and they'll say, hey, would you take a look at this one? Would you take a look at this one? But they know that we make our own decisions independent of them inviting us in. And we'll talk with the CEO first. And when we decide we want to invest in the company, we'll also reach out to the existing investors to make sure they're aware. But it's really the CEO that's getting us in. And we do try to get there before the round is completely oversubscribed and they have to start kicking people out. We'd rather not be the one who's kicking people out. That leads to bad blood.
Yeah.
Right. I like your strategy, and I would say it's most unique strategy I have ever seen. So you were very smart to write this book about blitzscaling, but we'll talk about just a bit later. And so you studied this startup so long. Do you have any ideas how to find a unicorn? How to recognize a unicorn?
Well, I think that the most important thing is to figure out something where, even if it's not obvious at first, once you explain what it is, everyone gets it and says, oh, of course, that's something that everyone should have, right? Oftentimes we want to be contrarian and right. This is a famous saying that Peter Thiel has. You want to be contrarian, but you also want to be right. And in my opinion, of course, it's good to find something that people have overlooked, but it should not be something where you have to spend hours explaining it and convincing people that this is something that makes sense. It should be something that hits them and they're like, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't realize that before. So these are the kinds of companies that we're looking for, where people say, oh, of course, I'd never thought of it that way, but of course, our lives would be better if we had this company or we had this product.
Okay, interesting, because many people believe that there is still no pattern how to find a unicorn, and Peter Thiel once said that the only pattern he found is that the founders of unicorns, of great companies, found a value for clients in very unexpected places, so so it's really hard to predict who will be the unicorn and who will not. And what is a startup that probably one or maybe several that you like the most in your portfolio?
Well, there are many great companies in our portfolio, but one of them that we can talk about, because we've been pretty public about this, is a company called Gametime that does last-minute ticketing for sporting events and concerts and the like. And this is a case where the idea is, well, when you are going to plan a night out, wouldn't it be great if you could get access to tickets at the last second? Usually, if we're going to a concert or a sporting event, we're thinking, oh, we have to plan it out months in advance, or alternately, we have to pay absurd amounts of money to a ticket scalper. And what Gametime does is it partners with the traditional ticket vendors, with the venues, with all these different folks, and make the tickets available at the last minute. So if you or I, Alexander, were like, oh, we really want to go out tonight, hey, let's take a look and see what kind of tickets we can get right now. And you can go through Gametime, get the tickets, and 30 seconds later, we could have been done with the transaction and say, okay, I'll meet you here and let's enjoy. So that's so much better. And again, the reason it wasn't possible before is because the old-fashioned approach was kind of slow, and it was based around pre-sales and everything like that. And so they said, okay, well, why don't we assume that people are going to be more interested in last-minute decisions in the future and make it work? And this, I think, makes a lot more sense. There are other companies that were trying to be in the last-minute travel section, like, for example, a Hotel Tonight. Like Hotel Tonight is very famous. Oh, I want to get a hotel tonight. Well, most of us don't like to go to a city and then risk not having a place to stay. So we prefer a hotel in advance. But in the case of, oh, let's do something tonight, well, then it's okay to wait, because you don't know when you have a group of people available to go out until that night. And if that's the case, boom, you want to be able to find a great event to go to.
So you're replacing the scalpers. They would hate you, right?
Oh, yes, the scalpers wouldn't like this one bit, but guess what? They're not the ones who control the ticket supply.
Okay. Will they do price gauging that if you do it in the last minutes, obviously? So would it be more expensive? Or?
Sometimes it's more expensive, sometimes it's less expensive, and sometimes it's about the same price. And the good news is that, if you go and you look, you can always choose, hey, this looks too expensive, let me go for a less expensive alternative. And the whole point is you get to pick something tonight, right? People want to go out and they want to spend time together. They don't necessarily have to be tied to a specific thing. Look, if you want to go see Taylor Swift, you should not take the chance. You should book that well in advance. But if you just want to do something fun for the night with your friends, then it's great. There are a lot of different options that might work.
And what was the stage at which you have invested? Was it round A, round B?
Series B.
Series B. And now?
Now the company has, since the time we invested about 18 months ago. No, was it 18 months ago? No, actually, it was only eight or 9 months ago. Since the time we invested, the company has tripled its revenue run rate and is just doing fantastic. We're very excited about the company as a result. Their biggest issue is how do we deal with growth?
But this is your specialties. So before we start to talk about your book, can I ask you one very maybe not so comfort question, but I need to.
Well, I will be happy to answer almost every question. Of course, I cannot answer questions which would cause me to break the law or violate any confidentiality agreements.
You know, probably it was John Doerr from Klein Perkins who said that if you want to become a VC, you need to lose like 25 million before you will be a good VC. So can you tell us about maybe your mistakes that you committed in past when you were investing and you did not probably underestimated some circumstances?
Oh, of course. I think that we all have these stories, which again, there's the stories of the decisions we made that we regret, and there's stories of investments we didn't make that we regret. So, for example, there was one company I invested in that was called Phone Halo, later became known as Tracker. It was sort of the arch rival to Tile. And for a while, it was growing incredibly fast. And I invested very early on. I met the founders before they raised any money. I was part of the first money in. And so I was sitting on these massive gains after Foundry did a big Series A, and then a Revolution came in and did a big Series B, and the company was doing great. And then ultimately flamed out and it wasn't worth anything. And so fortunately, I hadn't yet spent the money, but it was painful to go from saying, wow, here is an investment that looks like I'm getting, probably at least 20 or 30x on, to suddenly getting nothing. So that was painful. But one of the things I learned, I remember I was at a conference where I saw Bill Gurley of Benchmark speak. And Bill was saying, we try to look back at our mistakes. Our mistakes are not the companies we invested in that failed. Our mistakes are the big successes that we didn't get into. And so really in Silicon Valley, you have to have a different attitude. It's not, oh, I want to avoid making any mistakes. I want to avoid making the big mistakes of omission by not doing something. And whenever people ask me, well, what's the biggest financial regret you have? I say, it's very simple. It's the fact that I was there when the very first social networks were getting started, when LinkedIn was launching. I wasn't at the company, but I was around watching the industry. And I got to know the founders. That's how I originally got to know Reed, because I was a big fan of LinkedIn. And at this time, which was 2002, I was not yet making any angel investments. And I didn't do what I probably should have done, which is quit my job and join LinkedIn. If I had either just invested a little bit of money in LinkedIn or quit my job and join LinkedIn, I would be so much richer today than I am now. But, what can you do?
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much for this. It's really interesting point of view about mistakes.
Do you take a board seat when you invest in a company? Do you take a board seat or?
No, I try to avoid board seats as much as possible.
Yeah, same as we are. And Sasha, probably it's your turn, and let's talk about the book.
Yeah, I know, like Chris, you started saying something about the growth. So I would imagine that is your specialty. And
that's right.
Confession, I have not read a book yet, but absolutely I'm going to, because one who was looking through it, it's really, everybody should read it, investors and entrepreneurs. But for people who have not read it, start with the title. What does it exactly mean?
Yes. So blitzscaling is a made-up word, because if you make up a word, it's a lot easier to trademark it, know when people are using your term, make a lot of money. All those things are very useful. And obviously it's played out, right? It's in the name of the firm itself, Blitzscaling Ventures. And what we do is we use it to refer to the practice of prioritizing speed over efficiency. And this is the key to some of the biggest successes in Silicon Valley and throughout the startup world. They are companies that are tackling big winner take most markets where they can claim the majority of the market, or they can establish themselves as the default standard and just become enormously valuable as a result. I mean, just look at the most valuable companies in the world. Apple is valuable because it controls the operating system and standard for mobile telephony. as well as computers. And most of us are probably doing this on Macs. I'm on my own MacBook Air right now, as a matter of fact. If we go beyond that, Microsoft, obviously hugely valuable thanks to its dominance of the desktop operating system and later the Office suite, and then later still Azure and cloud computing. Amazon, retail and cloud computing. All of these things are companies that dominate these valuable winner-take-most markets. And the whole point is, if you have a chance to become the next Apple or Google or Amazon, then it's so valuable to be first. And it's so much more valuable to be first than to be second or third, that you should go all out in order to win. And that is the principle of blitzscaling. It doesn't work in all situations. Not every market is winner take most. And in other kinds of markets, blitzscaling is the wrong strategy. But for a very specific kind of company in a very specific situation, it's the best way to build a multi-billion-dollar company quickly.
But you mentioned Apple and yes, Amazon. But not to date myself, but I do remember the the days when you were just like young companies, right? And they didn't scale that fast. They didn't.
Well, so let's talk about that for a second. Amazon in 1996 had revenues of $5 million. That was the year they went public. They had revenues of $5 million. In 1999, Amazon had revenues of $1.6 billion. So that's pretty fast growth, right? That's over 300x growth in 3 years. So that's pretty remarkable. Again, at some point, growth has to slow. You can't grow 50x a year for many years in a row. Eventually, it's going to slow down. Apple, sort of same thing. The thing about Apple was, it was not the company as a whole, it's the individual businesses. So the extremely rapid growth of the iPhone business, which now accounts for the majority of the value of Apple, for example, began growing from a standing start in 2007 and grew very rapidly to then dominate this industry. So it is not always the case that the entire company grows at a certain rate, but a new product, a new business line, something is growing very quickly and then becoming a dominant player.
So when we talk about scale, is it about sales? Is it about the headcount? Is it about the product line? Like, what are we scaling?
Excellent question. The most important thing to scale is the number of users. And that's because that's ultimately where everything comes from, right? Without lots and lots of users, you don't get revenues. And without lots and lots of users, you don't have a reason to grow your headcount. So it really is focused on the number of users. That's the most important thing. And everything else sort of follows from there. That being said, when you're managing a company, in many ways, the most important thing is the number of people you have, because the number of people you have determines the kind of management you can employ. And a 10-person company is very different from a 100-person company. A 100-person company is very different from a 1,000-person company. And as a founder, you have to be able to adapt as your company grows. Otherwise, you are going to try to run a 1,000-person company like the 10-person company, and you're going to fail.
But I will look at the big companies, and yes, like Amazon. Amazon did not turn a profit like for many, many years.
That's right.
And they were growing fast. So do we care about these numbers?
You need to make money eventually. But in the case of Amazon, Jeff Bezos was able to convince investors that he could defer profits into the future. And the longer he could defer those profits, the longer he could operate unprofitably, the more he could drive other competitors out of business, the more he could invest in new things. Like building out the Kindle cost hundreds of millions of dollars for a brand new product. But he was able to do it because investors were convinced that they believed in his vision for the long term. So you don't have to make money immediately. It's always nice to make money immediately. And some companies do. Google made money immediately once they turned on their AdWords system, and they just funded themselves out of revenue. That's great. That's the best way to grow. But if you're Amazon and you're able to fund yourself with investors, and even though you're unprofitable, that works too, as long as you know how you're going to become profitable one day. And Amazon figured that out through its retailing business, by adding a marketplace business, and of course with Amazon Web Services.
So I flipped through some pages of your book, and you do discuss in great detail with good numbers, graphs like on Amazon and Google and Apple. Do you talk at all about Uber Another
Uber is
growing company.
Uber is a fascinating story, and it's a story that still hasn't finished being told yet. So we do talk a little bit about Uber because they were great practitioners of blitzscaling and rapid growth. And the question was always, is this the right kind of business for them to do that? And of course, Uber was first known for ride hailing and growing that very rapidly. I would argue that it is certainly valuable, but it is not as valuable as something like Airbnb because the nature of the transaction is much more commoditized, right?
Yep.
The Uber ride, I always tell everyone, all right, here's the way to tell the difference. When you get an Uber ride, do you ever reject the driver and wait for another one? No. When you get an Airbnb, do you ever just book the first one you see, or do you look through like 10 or 15 different listings before you pick the one that you think is right for you? Right? That reflects the difference between the nature of the relationship and the transaction. Uber has very cleverly been able to do a lot of things. Like they were able to transition very quickly from Uber to also Uber Eats and the food delivery during the pandemic. And they grew that business incredibly rapidly during the pandemic. It's a remarkable achievement, especially considering they have really strong competitors like DoorDash and Grubhub and the like. So I have a lot of admiration for Uber and what Dara Khosrowshahi has been able to do there. I do think that the story continues to be written because, when self-driving cars come, what will happen to Uber itself? But there's no question that Uber has made a tremendous amount of money for its investors over the years and has brought a lot of good to the world in terms of the consumers.
Well, maybe it also has something to do with the culture, and you do address that.
Yes.
Because there is no real rule book for a growing company, because each company, whether we like it or not, they figured it out while playing, right?
That's right.
So how do you scale when there are no rules?
Well, that is where culture comes in, right? You have to have a set of principles and people that you trust to apply those principles in situations where you don't have time to make rules and where things are changing too quickly to just be able to follow rules. And so principles are things like, Nordstrom's very famous, take care of the customer, or Amazon, start with first principles. All these different things are principles that you can follow instead of very specific rules, which are never going to be able to cover all the new situations that arise. And so having a culture that very strongly coordinates people is important. Now, again, not all cultures are good, and the original culture at Uber was very bad in many ways. They mistreated people, they violated laws and all that. That was a negative, but the culture also was really action oriented and really aggressive and helped them achieve success. So I think that, it's one of these things where, of course, I would love to say that you have to have a good culture to succeed. But as we say in the book, you don't necessarily have to have a good culture to succeed. You need a strong culture to succeed. If you have a good culture, but it's weak, it's not going to actually succeed. You need a strong culture. And of course, the best thing is to have a strong, good culture.
Yeah. Alexander and I deal with many Eastern European startups willing to come to the US, and they become US companies. And what we've noticed, and Alex, correct me if you disagree, that the main difference is they want to build something to perfection. They need to figure out every detail. And what we are saying, no, start selling before you finish a product, because the market will change, everything will change.
That's right.
And that's where the scale comes into play too, right? So
absolutely.
Right. So will you comment on that? What would you recommend to entrepreneurs, like when they're really perfecting their product and you're saying, no, you need to scale? So
right. The fact is there's no perfect product, and nobody is enough of a genius to know what that perfect product is. Steve Jobs was the greatest business genius we've ever seen, and he launched the iPhone without an app store. He thought that just the Apple provided apps were enough. So the fact is, you need to get out there, because you're going to learn from being out in the market far more than you'll learn from, some sort of focus group or something like that. And you're never going to get it right the first time. There's no perfect product, right? The original Tesla Roadster is not a perfect car. The original iPhone is not a perfect phone. All these things, nothing is ever perfect. You got to get it out there and improve it.
Do you mention anything like a Clubhouse in your book? Like, can we talk about that?
So we talked about Clubhouse. So So the book came out, was published long before Clubhouse came out, but I have spoken about Clubhouse. And what's interesting about Clubhouse is it had a lot of promise in the sense that, in theory, an audio social network could be enormously powerful, right? Imagine a social network that we could use while we're walking the dog or washing dishes, all these things that we could never do with
Right.
Facebook or Instagram or even TikTok. But Clubhouse completely failed to build that, right? What they really ended up building was pretty bad, low quality talk radio. And it was really more about putting on shows than it was about building something that was an experience for a small group of people. I appreciate, again, they had stars in their eyes. They're like, wow, we can get Elon Musk to come on and interview the CEO of Robinhood. This is incredible. But
Yeah.
really, the value would be in getting people to develop the habit of getting together in a small group of people who really care about each other. And the other thing is what I call on-demand socialization, allowing people to have human content and human contact whenever they wanted it. And I think that they were deceived by the fact that they had such growth during the pandemic. And the reason was simple. I mean, I went and I looked at Clubhouse as a potential investment and rejected it. And the reason is I said, I went and I talked to a bunch of people and asked them how they used it. And over again, there was one thing in common. Every power user of Clubhouse was either part of the staff at Andreessen Horowitz or was stuck by themselves during the pandemic who lived alone and had no human contact. So I'm like, okay, there's only two groups of people in the world, and one of them is eventually going to go away, and the other is too small to make a difference.
Right. So when you say that scale, maybe this whole notion is not for every company, but if the company wants to be a market leader, it has to move
Yes,
fast. But then
absolutely.
you also say that within the company, probably different departments have different rules, right? And maybe one department should go and explode, right? And others maybe not as fast. So how do you decide
right.
which part of your company needs to be this speeding, flying?
Well, you basically have to go and say, okay, and in which organization, which function does getting to scale increase the value? Like, this is what the definition of a network effect is. As you get more users, it becomes valuable for all the users, and individually as well as collectively. And so it's like, okay, as we scale up this team, does this improve our capability at a super linear rate? If it's just linear, if we have 10 people and we go to 20 people, we now have twice the capability. That's not enough. We need to say, when we go to from 10 people to 20 people, we can do 4 times as much.
Also, how do you decide what could be ignored and where you cannot really cut corners? Because if you grow fast, then you will ignore something. How do you decide?
You have to make a judgment call on what day and what will not. Right? You have to take care of the things that are immediate, urgent, that will kill your business if you don't take care of them. But there's a lot of other things that it's described as letting fires burn. There's got to be some fires you let burn because you don't have enough time to solve all the problems. There are more problems than you could ever possibly solve.
Right. Well, we're mindful of your time, so we could talk for hours, but we promised you it will not be more than 30 minutes. So
well,
just my last question. In one of the interviews, your partner, co-writer, Reid Hoffman, said in one of his interviews when she was asked about the origin of your name, and the person asking the question says that Blitzkrieg comes to mind. Is it connected at all?
That is true. So here's the thing, and we talk about it in the book. The term blitzscaling does explicitly come from Blitzkrieg. That's what put it in our mind, right? The lightning war and the lightning scaling is what we thought. And we agonized over this because, of course, I'm sure your ancestors, your parents, or perhaps grandparents experienced this in a very negative way. And that's true for a lot of people in Europe. And we this term really brings up some old wounds. Do we really want to use it? And we tried to come up with other terms, and none of them really resonated with people to the same extent. And so we said, it has been almost a century, and this is the term that works best. And we explained that we don't intend to have this word, cause any sort of emotional harm to anyone, but it is the best description for what we're talking about.
Blitz is a good word. We just need to bring it back to its original meaning and just forget all the politics around it. I love
Absolutely.
the title is very catchy, and I
Thank
definitely am
you.
not going to read your book, and I recommend it to all of our listeners and at all of my entrepreneurial and investor friends. And Alex, should we?
Yeah, we just have last question where our listeners can get this book.
Absolutely. Well, you know, you can look up any information about me at just chrisyeh.com, CHRISYEH.com. And we have pointers to various bookstores at blitzscaling.com. So that's BLITZSCALING.com. And between those two, you should find whatever you need.
Okay, great. Great. Thank you very much, Chris, for today's meeting. And we'll be glad to see you again.
My pleasure. I look forward to getting together with the rest of the team from VC House in the future.
Exactly.